Have you ever followed the rules, stayed disciplined, and kept pushing forward, yet still felt like your life was barely moving, as if all your effort was falling into a quiet hole that never fills? You wake up with intention, you start your day with responsibility, and you tell yourself that consistency will eventually pay you back, even if the results have been delayed for years. And still, deep down, there's that heavy feeling that whispers, something is wrong, not with your effort, but with what your effort is actually creating. This is the story of Mark, a man who didn't lack discipline, didn't lack work ethic, and didn't lack commitment, yet somehow lived with the constant frustration of progress that never felt real. Mark wasn't the type of person who waited to feel motivated, because he believed motivation was unreliable, and discipline was the only thing he could trust. He woke up early, often before sunrise, not because it was inspiring, but because he thought waking up early was proof that he was serious about changing his life. His mornings were quiet and repetitive, filled with routines he never questioned, like he was running the same program every day and expecting a different outcome. He put on the same worn clothes, moved through the same familiar spaces, and carried the same mental weight that never seemed to get lighter. Even before work began, Mark already felt tired, not just physically, but mentally, as if his mind had been carrying years of unfinished results. His hands were rough from effort, his body moved with practiced endurance, and his face carried the subtle look of someone who has been trying for a long time. Mark worked hard, but more than that, he worked faithfully, believing that effort is always rewarded, even if the reward arrives late. He didn't complain much, not because life was easy, but because he believed complaining was useless, and he'd rather spend energy working than talking. While others paused, Mark continued. While others stepped back, Mark stepped forward, and he convinced himself that pushing through was the only path. To Mark, stopping felt dangerous, because stopping would force him to face the possibility that he had been working in circles. So he stayed busy, because busy felt like safety, and movement felt like proof that he was not failing. But year after year, Mark's life stayed strangely similar, like time was passing, yet nothing meaningful was changing. The bills kept coming, the stress stayed close, and the sense of almost making it never became, I made it. It wasn't that Mark expected perfection, but he expected evidence, some sign that his effort was building something solid. Instead, progress felt distant, like it belonged to other people who somehow understood life in a way Mark didn't. Mark looked around and saw people moving forward with less struggle, less exhaustion, and less visible sacrifice, and it left him confused. Some people worked fewer hours, seemed calmer, and still managed to grow, and Mark couldn't understand the math of it. He began to feel like he was doing everything right, yet living as if he was always behind, always catching up, always almost there. Quietly, in the moments when no one was watching, Mark started asking himself questions that felt uncomfortable to hold. What am I missing? He wondered. Why isn't this working? And the hardest part was that he didn't have an answer. Those questions didn't stop him from working, but they followed him, sitting silently in the back of his mind like a shadow. Maybe you know this feeling, the feeling of giving everything you have and still feeling like you're not getting anywhere. Maybe you've had days where you were busy from morning to night, but at the end you felt empty, like nothing truly moved forward. And when that happens, most people do the same thing Mark did. They push harder, they add more pressure, and they demand more from themselves. Mark extended his days, cut his rest short, and tried to force progress through sheer effort, as if life could be pressured into changing. But exhaustion arrived faster than success ever did, and the more tired Mark became, the less clear his mind felt. It wasn't just physical fatigue. It was the mental fog that forms when you keep running without knowing where you're going. One evening, after another long day that felt like it produced nothing but tiredness, Mark didn't go straight inside. He stopped outside, sat down, and allowed silence to stay with him, because for once he had no energy left to perform strength. The sun was setting slowly, the air felt still, and the world seemed quiet enough for Mark to hear his own thoughts again. In that stillness, Mark noticed something he hadn't felt in a long time. Space. The kind of space where clarity can finally appear. For the first time in weeks, he didn't plan tomorrow's tasks. He didn't list everything he needed to fix, and he didn't pressure himself to work harder. Instead, a different thought appeared, one that felt almost rebellious, asking, what if working harder isn't the answer? That thought hit Mark in a sensitive place, because his identity was built around effort, and effort was the one thing he was proud of. Questioning effort felt like questioning his worth, and Mark didn't want to face the possibility that he had been trying the wrong way. But the thought stayed with him, not aggressively, but persistently, like a quiet voice that refuses to disappear. It asked him something even more uncomfortable. What if effort without direction is the real reason you feel stuck? Mark looked back over the years and saw a pattern he had ignored. Countless days filled with movement, but not enough days filled with intention. He realized he had been busy, extremely busy, but he had rarely paused to ask whether his work was actually aimed at something meaningful. And as that realization formed, Mark felt a strange mix of discomfort and relief, because confusion finally had a shape. He understood something that sounds simple, but changes everything. Effort is powerful, but direction decides whether effort becomes growth. The next morning looked the same from the outside. The same early alarm, the same quiet air, the same responsibilities waiting patiently for him. But inside Mark, something had shifted, not like a dramatic transformation, but like a small light turning on in a room that had been dark for years. Before he rushed into the day, Mark paused for a moment, and that pause itself felt unusual, because he was used to starting immediately. He asked himself a question he had never truly asked with honesty. What is the one thing I can do today that actually moves my life forward? At first, his mind tried to answer with a long list, because Mark's habit was to carry everything and fix everything all at once. But Mark stayed with the question and refused to let it become another overwhelming plan that would leave him exhausted before he even began. He reminded himself that this was not about doing more. It was about aiming better, and aiming requires choosing what matters most. After a few quiet minutes, an answer appeared, small and specific, not impressive, but clear enough to act on. That day, Mark worked hard as always, but now he protected his focus, treating that one chosen task like a priority, not like an option. He noticed something surprising. When he had one target, his mind felt calmer, because it didn't have to hold 10 competing directions. When the day ended, nothing magical happened. There was no sudden success, but Mark felt less scattered and less emotionally drained. That night, Mark realized something important. Clarity creates a different kind of energy, the kind that doesn't burn you out so quickly. The next morning, Mark repeated the process, and he asked the same question again, because direction is not a one-time decision. It's a daily practice. Some mornings, the answer came easily, and other mornings, the answer felt unclear, because Mark was still learning how to listen to himself. On the difficult mornings, Mark didn't punish himself. He simply returned to the question and gave it time, like waiting for a signal through noise. Slowly, Mark began to see how often he used busy to avoid deciding, because deciding is painful when you're afraid of choosing wrong. He realized that doing everything is not the same as doing what matters, and that truth made him uncomfortable in the best way. As days passed, Mark started noticing patterns, like which tasks created real progress and which tasks only created the illusion of productivity. He began to see how easy it is to stay safe by staying busy, because busy protects you from the risk of focusing on something that might fail. But Mark also began to understand that progress always requires risk, because it requires committing your attention to one direction. Some days were still heavy, because direction doesn't remove difficulty, and clarity doesn't eliminate effort. It simply makes effort useful. On those heavy days, Mark reminded himself that the goal wasn't to feel good. The goal was to build something real, one focused step at a time. Weeks passed, and even though the progress was quiet, Mark could finally feel that something was changing under the surface. He noticed he was less anxious at night because he no longer felt like he had to carry the entire world on his shoulders. He noticed he was less bitter toward others because his mind stopped comparing his exhaustion to their calm and started protecting his own path. And then gradually, small results appeared, not dramatic results, but real evidence that direction was working. A conversation went better because Mark prepared with focus. A task finished sooner because Mark stopped multitasking. A plan moved forward because Mark chose one piece. Mark realized something that many people never realize. Progress is often quiet, and growth is often invisible until it becomes undeniable. This gave him a new kind of confidence, not the loud confidence of winning, but the steady confidence of knowing he was finally moving. Mark still worked hard, but now his hard work didn't feel like punishment, because it was guided by intention instead of panic. He understood that hard work is a tool, and like any tool, it can build or destroy depending on how you use it. If you use hard work without direction, it can destroy your energy, your hope, and your self-respect, because you keep giving without seeing a return. But if you guide hard work with clarity, it becomes one of the most powerful forces in your life, because it turns your days into progress. Mark began to treat direction like a skill, something you practice daily, not something you wait to magically discover. He learned that you don't find direction by thinking endlessly. You find it by choosing, acting, reflecting, and choosing again. And slowly, Mark's life became less about survival and more about building, less about reacting and more about shaping. He realized that most people don't fail because they lack effort. They fail because their effort is scattered across too many directions. This is why people can work 12-hour days and still feel stuck, because movement is not the same as progress. Progress requires aim, and aim requires the courage to simplify, to choose one thing, and to let the rest wait. If you feel stuck right now, if you feel tired despite trying your best, consider the possibility that you don't need more force. Consider the possibility that you need a pause, a quiet moment to ask yourself where your energy is truly going. Ask yourself, honestly and without judgment, whether you are working hard or whether you are working with direction. Because the problem is rarely your effort, and it is rarely your discipline. The deeper problem is often where you are aiming that discipline. And when you change your aim, you don't have to become a new person overnight. You simply become a clearer person, one decision at a time. So today, before you push harder, take a breath and choose one direction that matters. One step that actually moves you forward. Not 10 steps, not everything at once, just one step with intention, because clarity has a way of turning small actions into real momentum. If this story resonated with you, hold on to this question and carry it into your day. Where am I aiming my effort? And remember this, quietly and clearly, the way Mark learned it. Every story reshapes your mindset, and every day is a chance to aim again. Have you ever opened your eyes in the morning and immediately felt late? Not late for a meeting, not late for a task, but late in life? As if the day had already started without you, and you're waking up to chase it? You sit up and try to gather yourself, yet your mind is already reaching outward, already scanning for problems, already searching for proof that something is waiting to go wrong. And you can feel that familiar weight settle in your chest before your feet even touch the floor. And even if nothing terrible has happened, even if your life looks fine from the outside, you still carry that private feeling that you're starting from the wrong place, like you're waking up in reaction mode instead of leadership mode. This is the story of Ethan, a man who didn't lack ambition, didn't lack intelligence, and didn't lack effort, yet somehow lived inside mornings that quietly drained his energy before the real day even began. Ethan wasn't careless, and he wasn't irresponsible, because he cared too much. And that care often turned into pressure, and pressure always shows itself first in the way you begin your day. He woke up each morning, telling himself that today would be different, that today he would focus, that today he would be calm. Yet his first movement was always the same, automatic and fast, like a reflex he never questioned. His hand reached for his phone, not because he truly needed it, but because his mind had learned to use it as a bridge away from silence. And silence was where his anxiety liked to wait. It never felt traumatic to Ethan because it was ordinary, because everyone did it, because it looked harmless. Yet the real effect was hidden in what it trained his attention to expect. Before his feet touched the floor, he checked notifications, messages, headlines, work chats, and within seconds, his nervous system received a signal that shaped the day without asking permission. The signal was simple and cruel. The world is already moving. People are already ahead. Problems already exist, and you are waking up behind the curve. So even on quiet mornings, even on days with no emergencies, Ethan felt tension in his shoulders, urgency in his thoughts, and a subtle fear that he was missing something important. He brushed his teeth while thinking about deadlines. He got dressed while replaying conversations, and he ate while scrolling, as if being alone with his own mind was something to avoid. And the strange part was that he thought this was normal, because so many people live like this. So many people call this adult life, and so many people accept it as the cost of being responsible. He didn't feel responsible, though. He felt trapped, as if his day belonged to everyone else before it belonged to him. He would walk into the morning with an invisible weight on his shoulders, and he couldn't explain it because nothing heavy had happened yet. But his body was already acting like danger was near. Sometimes he tried to fix it with bigger solutions, because big solutions feel hopeful when you're tired of small failures. He watched videos about perfect morning routines, bought supplements, downloaded habit apps, and promised himself he would wake up earlier and become a new person by force. But every plan collapsed at the exact same point, not later in the day, not after lunch, not after work, but right at the beginning, because the beginning was where his mind was being programmed. The first 5 minutes were always the weak point, because the first 5 minutes decided what his brain would search for all day. When the first 5 minutes were chaotic, the rest of the day became damage control, and even good intentions couldn't survive that kind of start. Ethan's life wasn't falling apart, yet it was quietly shrinking, because anxiety at the start of the day makes you live smaller without realizing it. He stopped taking risks, not because he didn't want growth, but because his mind was always tired, and tired minds choose safety over possibility. He delayed projects, avoided uncomfortable decisions, and stayed in habits that numbed him, because it's hard to build a new life when you wake up already emotionally flooded. He kept telling himself he needed discipline, yet discipline is hard to access when your nervous system begins the day in threat mode. Over time, that constant morning pressure hardened into a deeper belief, a belief he never said out loud, but carried everywhere like a quiet label. Maybe this is just who I am, he thought. And that thought felt heavy because it sounded like a conclusion instead of a season. Maybe I'm the kind of person who tries, but never really changes. And once you believe that, you don't just lose motivation, you lose identity. One morning, Ethan sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the floor. And for a rare moment, he didn't reach for his phone immediately, not because he was strong, but because he felt empty and tired of repeating himself. In that quiet second, he noticed how quickly his mind searched for an escape, how urgently it wanted stimulation, and how uncomfortable it felt to simply exist without input. That was the moment he realized he wasn't addicted to information, because information wasn't the real need his body was asking for. He was addicted to escape, because escape was how he avoided feeling his fear, his uncertainty, and the quiet dissatisfaction beneath his busy life. The phone was not just a habit, it was a shield, and the shield protected him from silence, because silence forced him to hear what he didn't want to admit. He still scrolled that morning, still rushed, still lived the familiar pattern. Yet a thought stayed with him like a splinter. What if my mornings are training my mind to stay anxious? Because training isn't always intentional. Sometimes training is repetition, and repetition builds pathways, whether you like it or not. That evening, Ethan went for a walk, not to exercise, not to hit a goal, but simply to breathe, because his head felt loud and his body felt tight in a way he couldn't explain. He passed a small park and saw an older man sitting on a bench with a notebook, not a phone, not earbuds, just a plain notebook and a calm posture that looked almost unfamiliar. The man's calm wasn't loud happiness, it was quiet steadiness, the kind that makes you wonder if he knows something you missed. Ethan sat on the other end of the bench, not planning to talk, just letting the air cool his thoughts. And for a while, neither of them spoke, as if silence was allowed to exist there. Then the older man said something simple and almost casual, yet it landed in Ethan's chest with surprising accuracy. Most people lose the day before it starts. Ethan laughed softly, partly because it sounded dramatic, and partly because it sounded too true, and he asked, "What do you mean?" The man nodded toward Ethan's hand, where the phone still rested like a reflex, and he said, "The first 5 minutes decide what your mind searches for all day." Ethan wanted to argue because 5 minutes sounded too small to matter. And when you've tried many things and failed, you become suspicious of anything that sounds simple. But the man's voice wasn't selling anything. It was calm and practical, like describing gravity, and that tone made Ethan listen differently. The man explained that if you begin your day with threat, your mind learns to expect threat, and once your mind expects threat, it creates stress even in silence, even when nothing is happening yet. Ethan felt exposed by that sentence, because it described his mornings perfectly, the way he felt attacked by the day before the day did anything to him. Ethan asked what he should do instead, and the man didn't offer a long routine, didn't offer a perfect schedule. He simply opened his notebook and showed small lines written with quiet consistency. He said he used a 5-minute anchor, not to become impressive, but to send a signal to his nervous system, a signal that said, "I lead this day, not the world." The man began with the simplest rule. Before any screen, sit up and place one hand on your chest so your body remembers you are here. He said to take 10 slow breaths with longer exhales than inhales, because long exhales tell the nervous system you are not in danger. And safety is where clarity begins. Then he said to write one sentence of clarity, not a list, not a journal entry, just one sentence about who you will be today, because identity shapes behavior more than motivation does. Finally, he said to take one tiny action that proves your sentence is real, something small enough to do on hard days, because the mind changes through repetition, not intensity. Ethan asked if that was really enough, and the man smiled like he'd heard that question before, and said it's enough because it survives real life, and survival is what builds consistency. Ethan walked home with a feeling he didn't recognize at first, not excitement, not inspiration, but permission to stop trying to fix everything at once, and instead fix the beginning. That night, he placed his phone across the room, not as punishment, but as a boundary, because boundaries are how you protect a new habit from an old reflex. He placed a notebook and pen where he could see them, not as decoration, but as a tool, because tools make intentions tangible. Before sleeping, he wrote one simple line that felt like an agreement with himself. "Tomorrow, I start with me." Morning arrived, the alarm rang, and Ethan's hand moved toward where the phone usually was, because habit moves faster than thought. But the phone wasn't there, and for a moment he felt irritation, because the mind hates losing its familiar escape. That irritation created a small window of choice, and in that window, Ethan remembered the anchor and sat up anyway. He placed a hand on his chest and noticed how fast his heart was beating, how shallow his breathing was, how his body was already acting like the day was a threat. He took the first slow breath, and it felt unnatural, because calm often feels unfamiliar to people who live inside urgency. He took the second breath, then the third, and something small began to soften. Not fully, but enough for him to notice the difference. By the 10th breath, his shoulders dropped slightly, and he realized how tense he usually was without knowing it, as if tension had become his default morning posture. He walked to the desk, opened the notebook, and felt his mind try to make it complicated, because anxious minds turn simple practices into heavy tasks. He wrote one sentence anyway. Today, I will be calm and focused, even if I can't control everything. And the sentence felt uncomfortable because it made him responsible for his attention. For the tiny action, he made his bed slowly and deliberately, not because it changed his life, but because it proved he could lead a moment. When the 5 minutes ended, nothing magical happened, yet something important also didn't happen. He hadn't panicked, he hadn't compared himself, and he hadn't surrendered his mind to the world. On day 2, the craving returned immediately, because one good morning doesn't erase a habit. It only reveals that a new choice is possible. He wanted to check his phone first, and the desire felt almost physical, like his brain demanding its usual stimulus. He did the anchor again anyway. Not perfectly, not dramatically, just honestly, because honesty keeps a practice alive when motivation fades. He breathed, wrote one sentence, did one small action, and noticed that his mind didn't start in full sprint, which made the rest of the morning slightly easier to carry. By day 4, the anchor still felt awkward, because new habits often feel fake at first. Yet Ethan kept showing up, because showing up is how fake becomes familiar. He realized the first 5 minutes were becoming a doorway, not a performance, because he wasn't trying to look disciplined. He was trying to feel present. By day 6, he noticed a shift in his internal question, from what did I miss to what do I choose? And that shift quietly changed the way he entered the world. At the end of the first week, his life hadn't changed on paper, but his experience of life had changed inside his body. And sometimes, that is where real change begins. In week 2, Ethan noticed how often his attention used to drift, how quickly his mind jumped from thought to thought, like a scared animal scanning for danger. Now, after the anchor, his focus stayed with him longer, not all day, not perfectly, but long enough to create momentum. He started doing one important task earlier, not because he became a productivity machine, but because he wasn't wasting his first hour in panic and comparison. He spoke more calmly in conversations, because he wasn't waking up already defensive, and he noticed that calm changes the way people respond to you. He felt less irritation at small problems, because he had already practiced steadiness before the problems arrived, and steadiness changes how problems feel. Week 3 brought a deeper realization. The anchor wasn't giving him productivity, it was giving him identity, because every morning it repeated the same message through action. He began to believe, I am the kind of person who leads my attention, not through affirmations, but through evidence, because evidence is what the brain trusts. He learned, I am the kind of person who chooses calm, because he practiced calm before the world could tell him what to fear. He started to feel, I am the kind of person who begins with intention, because intention became a daily behavior instead of a vague wish. Ethan still had mornings where he failed, mornings where he grabbed the phone, mornings where he rushed, because change is never a straight line. But he stopped treating failure as proof that he was broken, and he stopped using one bad morning as permission to abandon the practice. He treated failure as feedback, and he returned to the anchor, because returning is what builds a habit, not perfection. Around day 20, Ethan noticed the world still had noise and demands, but those things felt slightly less personal, like they didn't automatically control his emotional state anymore. He felt a small layer of inner stability, not constant happiness, but a steadier baseline, as if his nervous system stopped living at the edge of a cliff. His sleep improved, not because his schedule changed, but because his mind wasn't trapped in a constant loop of unfinished stress that began every morning and never fully ended. He understood that the anchor was training his brain the way exercise trains the body, not through one intense session, but through small daily signals. Those signals taught his nervous system safety, because safety is what allows focus to exist without force. They taught his attention direction, because direction is easier to hold when you're not starting the day in panic mode. On day 30, Ethan looked back and realized the anchor did not change his life by being impressive. It changed his life by being repeatable, because repeatable is what becomes permanent. He saw that he had stopped beginning the day as a victim of information and started beginning as a person who chooses what enters his mind first. He realized that 5 minutes will not remove your problems, but it will change your posture toward your problems. And posture is often the beginning of power. So if you wake up feeling heavy, if you feel behind before you even begin, consider this not as a rule you must obey, but as an experiment you can test. For the next 30 days, protect the first 5 minutes of your morning as if they are the doorway to your entire day, because in many ways they are. Before any screen, sit up and place one hand on your chest so your body remembers you are here, not yesterday, not tomorrow, but here. Take 10 slow breaths with longer exhales than inhales. Write one sentence about who you will be today. Then do one tiny action that proves that sentence is real. Because you are not building a perfect routine, you are building a mind that does not collapse at the start of the day. And that kind of mind changes everything downstream. And remember this quietly and clearly, the way Ethan learned it through repetition rather than inspiration. Every story reshapes your mindset, and every morning is a chance to begin with yourself. Have you ever built the perfect morning routine? Woke up early, drank the water, did the workout, took the cold shower, wrote the journal, and still felt empty, like you were doing everything right? Yet something inside you stayed quiet and unsatisfied? You finish the routine and look around as if the day should feel different now, but instead you feel the same. And the strangest part is that you can't explain why, because on paper, you did what successful people do. This is the story of Ryan, a man who tried every morning routine he could find, not because he loved routines, but because he was desperate to finally feel like his life had meaning again. Ryan wasn't lazy, and he wasn't careless, because he was the kind of person who could force himself to do hard things. And that ability made him believe that discipline alone could fix anything. So when he started feeling empty, he treated emptiness like a problem to solve, and he went looking for a system that promised a clear result. He watched videos about high performers, downloaded habit trackers, followed influencers, and copied routines step by step, as if life was a machine and the right sequence would finally produce happiness. For a while it felt exciting, because new routines feel like a fresh start, and fresh starts give the mind hope, even before anything truly changes. He bought a new alarm clock, planned his mornings the night before, and felt proud when he checked boxes early, because checking boxes is a clean kind of progress. But after a few days, the same feeling returned, not always dramatic, sometimes subtle, like a quiet grayness that followed him even after he did everything correctly. He would stand in the kitchen with his protein shake and feel nothing, and that scared him, because he thought effort should earn him something emotional. So he changed the routine again, because when you don't get the feeling you want, you assume the method is wrong, not the reason you're doing it. He switched to meditation, then breath work, then gratitude journaling, then a 5 a.m. run, then affirmations, then cold plunges, then reading 10 pages, then writing goals, then all of them together. Some mornings he looked like a disciplined machine, moving from task to task, yet inside he still felt like a person waiting for life to start. And what made it worse was that everyone praised him, because his routine looked impressive from the outside, And praise can make you feel even more lonely when the inside doesn't match. Ryan started asking himself a dangerous question in the quiet moments after the routine was done. Why am I still empty if I'm doing everything I'm supposed to do? He didn't say that question out loud because it sounded ungrateful. And when you feel empty, you often pretend you're fine because you don't want to disappoint people who think you're strong. So he kept optimizing, as if emptiness was a performance issue, as if he just needed to tweak a few variables and the feeling would finally appear. But the more he optimized, the more trapped he felt, because routines became a cage when they were built to escape a feeling instead of build a life. Ryan didn't notice it at first, but he was using routines the way some people use noise, as a way to avoid hearing the deeper truth under the surface. Because emptiness isn't always a lack of discipline. Sometimes emptiness is a signal, and signals get louder when you keep ignoring them. Ryan's days were full, yet he felt hollow. And hollow is a different kind of tired, because it's not physical exhaustion. It's the exhaustion of living without direction. He still succeeded at work, still met expectations, still looked responsible, but inside he felt disconnected, like his life was happening around him rather than through him. He started waking up with a quiet dread, not because he hated his life, but because he couldn't feel it. And not feeling your life is one of the most painful experiences a person can carry. So he chased morning routines harder, because morning routines were the one place he could control, and control feels safe when meaning feels uncertain. One morning he woke up and realized he was tired before he even started. And that tiredness wasn't from the routine itself. It was from the pressure that the routine had to fix him. Because when you believe the routine must save you, every morning becomes a test. And failing a test of identity feels heavier than failing a task. Ryan sat on the edge of his bed and stared at his checklist. And instead of feeling motivated, he felt resentment because his routine had become a job he didn't apply for. He did it anyway because he was disciplined. But as he meditated, he felt restless. As he exercised, he felt numb. And as he wrote gratitude, he felt dishonest. That morning, the emptiness felt sharper. Not cruel, but clear, like a message finally breaking through the noise. This isn't working. Ryan tried to distract himself with the day, but the feeling followed him. And by evening, he felt the quiet panic of a person who has tried everything and doesn't know what to try next. He went for a walk, not as part of a routine, but because he needed air. And sometimes the body asks for simplicity when the mind becomes too complex. He walked past a small bookstore and stopped without planning to. And something about the stillness inside pulled him in, as if his nervous system wanted a different kind of environment. Inside, an older woman was rearranging books on a table, calm and unhurried, and Ryan felt drawn to that calm because he hadn't felt it in a long time. He wandered the shelves, not searching for a title, just moving, and the woman looked up and asked a simple question that landed with unexpected precision. "What are you looking for?" Ryan almost answered with a joke, but the question hit deeper than books, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond because he didn't know what he was looking for anymore. He finally said, "I don't know," and the honesty in that sentence surprised him because he rarely admitted uncertainty out loud. The woman nodded as if she understood, and she said something quiet that changed the shape of the problem. You can't fill emptiness with routines if the emptiness is coming from a life you don't feel connected to. Ryan felt defensive because he had worked hard, and people who work hard don't want to hear that effort might be aimed at the wrong target. He asked what she meant, and she pointed to the notebook in his hand, the habit tracker he carried everywhere like proof that he was trying. She said routines are powerful, but they're not a substitute for meaning, and meaning doesn't come from optimizing your morning. It comes from living in alignment with what matters to you. Ryan didn't know how to measure that because he knew how to measure tasks, steps, minutes, pages, but he didn't know how to measure whether his life felt real. So he asked the only question he knew, "What should I do?" The woman didn't give him a complicated plan. Because complicated plans feed the same addiction to control, and control is not the same as connection. She gave him a simple framework, a different kind of morning practice, not a performance routine, but an alignment routine, designed to answer a deeper question. She called it the 3 anchors, and she said if you start your day anchored, your actions stop feeling empty because they begin to belong to you again. The first anchor, she said, is presence, because emptiness grows when you live in your head and never arrive in your body. The second anchor is purpose, because effort without purpose becomes motion that trains you instead of building you. The third anchor is connection, because the deepest emptiness is often loneliness, even when people are around you, because you can be surrounded and still feel unseen. Ryan listened carefully, because for the first time in months, he felt like someone was naming the real problem rather than selling him a louder solution. She told him to try it for 30 days, not because 30 days is magic, but because the mind needs repetition to trust a new direction. That night, Ryan didn't plan an intense routine. He simply wrote 3 lines on a piece of paper and placed it where he would see it in the morning. The lines were simple: arrive, aim, connect, and the simplicity made him nervous, because simple things feel too small when you're used to chasing big fixes. Morning came, and Ryan woke up and felt the familiar urge to perform, to immediately prove he was disciplined, to begin sprinting so he wouldn't feel behind. But he paused because he remembered the first anchor, and he sat up slowly and placed one hand on his chest to remind his body that he was here. He took 10 slow breaths and noticed how quickly his mind tried to run away, how quickly it searched for stimulation, and how uncomfortable stillness felt. He didn't fight the discomfort. He simply stayed present, because presence is not the absence of anxiety. It is the decision not to abandon yourself when anxiety appears. When the breaths ended, he moved to the second anchor, and instead of writing goals, he wrote one sentence of purpose, one sentence about what kind of person he wanted to be today. Not what he wanted to achieve, but who he wanted to be, because emptiness often comes from living as a worker rather than a person. He wrote, "Today I will act like my life matters," and the sentence felt strange, because he realized he hadn't been acting like that, even while he was achieving things. Then he moved to the third anchor, connection, and he asked himself one question that felt almost too human for a routine. Who needs me today? And who do I need today? He wrote one name, not 10, one person he would reach out to, not to impress, not to network, but to connect. He sent a simple message, not long, not dramatic, just honest, and the act of sending it made him feel a small warmth that his checklists never produced. After the anchors, he still exercised, still worked, still lived his responsibilities. But something was different, because his actions were now linked to a deeper intention. The day didn't feel perfect, but it felt more real, like he was inside it rather than watching it. And that difference mattered more than productivity. On day 2, his mind tried to return to optimization, because the mind loves measurable control and connection is harder to measure. But he kept the anchors, because the goal wasn't to build an impressive routine. The goal was to build a life that didn't feel empty. By the end of the first week, Ryan noticed something surprising. His emptiness wasn't constant anymore. It came in waves, and waves can be navigated. He realized emptiness often arrived when he abandoned presence, when he chased tasks to avoid feelings, and when he avoided honest connection. So instead of adding more habits, he protected the anchors, because anchors don't add weight, they add stability. In week 2, he started seeing how many of his routines were built from fear. Fear of falling behind, fear of wasting time, fear of not being enough. And he realized fear-based routines can create discipline, but they can't create fulfillment, because fear motivates movement, not meaning. He began to choose a different driver, not fear, but alignment. And alignment made his effort feel lighter, because it wasn't a fight against himself. He started saying no to routines that were performative, routines he did to feel superior or safe, and he kept the routines that supported presence and purpose. He learned that a morning routine is not meant to make you impressive. It's meant to make you available to your own life. In week 3, he noticed his focus improved, not because he forced it, but because his mind wasn't constantly searching for something missing. When you feel connected to meaning, you stop needing constant stimulation because you're no longer trying to escape yourself. Ryan still had empty moments, because emptiness doesn't disappear overnight, but he stopped panicking when it arrived, because he understood what it was pointing to. It was pointing to disconnection, and disconnection can be repaired, not with more performance, but with presence, purpose, and connection. On day 20, Ryan woke up and realized he didn't feel dread, not because his life changed dramatically, but because he changed the way he entered his life. He started the day arriving in his body, aiming his effort toward values, and reconnecting with people. And those 3 things made the day feel less hollow. By day 30, he could finally name the truth that had been hidden under all his routines. He wasn't empty because he lacked discipline. He was empty because his life wasn't aligned with what mattered. He realized you can wake up early and still live numb. You can meditate and still avoid truth. You can journal and still hide from yourself if your routines are only escapes. But when routines become anchors, they stop being cages and they become doorways. And doorways lead you back into your own life. So if you've tried every morning routine and still feel empty, don't assume you're broken, and don't assume you need a harder routine. Instead, ask a deeper question before you add another habit. Am I doing this to connect with my life, or am I doing this to run from it? Try the 3 anchors for 30 days. Arrive in your body, aim your effort toward values, and connect with one real person each morning. Because emptiness is not defeated by performance, it's healed by alignment. And alignment begins the moment you stop trying to optimize your morning and start trying to live your life. And remember this quietly and clearly, the way Ryan learned it through repetition and honesty. Every story reshapes your mindset, and every morning is a chance to feel your life again. Have you ever noticed how one bad morning can hijack your entire day? Like your mood gets decided before you even understand what happened? You wake up late, your mind is already racing, your body feels heavy, and suddenly everything feels harder than it should. And even when nothing terrible happened, you still feel behind, like the day started without your permission. This is the story of Ethan, a man who spent years blaming his life, his job, and his lack of motivation, until he discovered a quiet truth that changed everything. Ethan believed his problems were big, complex, and permanent, because that's what it feels like when you're stuck inside the same patterns. He thought he needed a new opportunity, a new environment, a new version of himself, because he assumed change had to be dramatic. But what Ethan didn't realize was that his entire life was being shaped by something much smaller than his dreams. It was being shaped by his mornings, the first 30 minutes that quietly trained his mind how to see the world. Every morning Ethan woke up and immediately checked his phone, not because he loved it, but because he didn't know how to sit with silence. The screen gave him instant stimulation, and stimulation felt like comfort when his mind felt uncertain. He would scroll through news, messages, and random content, and his brain would fill with other people's emotions before he even found his own. By the time he stood up, his nervous system was already activated, and he didn't understand why he felt anxious. Then he would rush into the bathroom, rush into clothes, rush into coffee, and his entire morning felt like reaction. It wasn't a morning, it was a chase, and he started the day already trying to catch up to something invisible. Ethan told himself he would focus later, he would be calm later, he would be disciplined later, but later rarely comes when you start in chaos. When he arrived at work, He felt irritated because his mind was already tired from consuming too much too early. He would snap at small things, overthink simple tasks, and feel like the world was moving faster than he could handle. And the most confusing part was that he wasn't always like this, because some days he felt sharp, calm, and productive. Those good days felt rare and unpredictable, like they depended on luck rather than something he could control. So Ethan began to believe that his personality was unstable, that his motivation was inconsistent, and that life was simply hard. But the truth was simpler. Ethan's mornings were training his mind to stay in a constant state of pressure. A pressured mind doesn't think clearly. It reacts quickly, and reaction creates mistakes that create more stress. Ethan didn't notice it, but his mornings were not neutral. They were setting the emotional tone of his entire day. Because the first thing you do in the morning becomes the first signal your brain receives about what kind of day this will be. If the first signal is urgency, your brain prepares for survival. If the first signal is comparison, your brain prepares for insecurity. If the first signal is noise, your brain prepares for distraction. Ethan's first signal was always noise, and noise is a thief that steals your attention before you choose where it goes. One morning, Ethan woke up and his phone was dead, and at first he felt frustrated, like something was missing. He stood there in silence, with no notifications, no quick dopamine, and he didn't know what to do with himself. So he sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall, and for the first time in a long time, he heard his own thoughts. His thoughts weren't inspirational. They were messy, anxious, and unfinished, but they were his. And that moment revealed something Ethan hadn't admitted. He was using his phone to escape his own mind. That realization felt uncomfortable because it meant the problem wasn't the world. It was how he was entering the world. Later that day, Ethan met an older coworker named Samuel, a calm man who never seemed rushed even when work was heavy. Ethan asked him how he stayed so steady, and Samuel didn't answer with motivation. He answered with a question. He asked Ethan how he starts his day, and Ethan laughed because starting the day felt like something that just happened to him. Samuel told him something simple. Your morning is your steering wheel, and most people hand it to the world. Ethan didn't fully understand, so Samuel explained it in a way Ethan could feel. He said your brain is like wet cement in the morning, and whatever steps on it first leaves the deepest imprint. Ethan felt that sentence land because his mornings did feel like his mind was softer, more sensitive, more easily shaped. Samuel said if you start your day in reaction, you spend the rest of the day reacting because your brain stays in the same mode. But if you start your day with intention, you build a different kind of day because you choose the first direction. Ethan wanted a practical answer, not philosophy, so Samuel gave him a small experiment. He said for 7 days, don't change your whole life, just change the first 10 minutes. Ethan was skeptical because 10 minutes sounded too small to matter. But Samuel told him small things matter most when they happen first, because first things define everything that follows. That night, Ethan charged his phone, but he placed it across the room, far enough that he couldn't grab it without standing up. He felt nervous doing that because he didn't like the idea of being alone with his mind. Morning came, and Ethan woke up and instinctively reached for his phone, and his hand found nothing. He felt a spike of irritation, as if the phone was a lifeline, and he realized how dependent he had become on immediate input. He stood up, walked to the phone, and then stopped, because he remembered the experiment. Instead of picking it up, he sat back down and took one slow breath, then another, then another. At first, it felt pointless, like breathing was too simple to change anything. But after a minute, something subtle happened. His mind slowed down just enough for him to feel present. Then Ethan opened the curtains and let light enter the room, and light felt like a signal of beginning, not urgency. He drank a glass of water slowly, not while scrolling, not while rushing, just as a quiet reset for his body. Then he wrote one sentence on paper, one sentence that would guide his day. He wrote, "Today I will protect my focus," and the sentence felt strong because it was clear. Ethan didn't do a perfect routine. He didn't meditate for 30 minutes. He didn't run a marathon. He simply entered the day differently, and that difference changed the way he felt inside his own skin. When he arrived at work, he noticed he wasn't irritated, and he didn't feel behind. He still had tasks, still had pressure, but his mind felt like it had a center. The day wasn't magical, but it was smoother, and Ethan realized smoothness is a form of freedom. On day 2, he repeated the experiment, and it felt slightly easier. On day 3, he noticed how quickly his mind wanted to reach for noise, because noise is the habit of avoiding yourself. But he also noticed something else. Without noise, his mind could finally hear what mattered. He began to realize that many of his problems weren't problems, they were emotional reactions created by rushed mornings. When you start the day in stress, you interpret everything as stress. When you start the day in calm, you interpret the same events differently. Ethan began to understand the invisible power of mornings. They don't just start the day, they train your identity. If you start in chaos, you become someone who lives in chaos. If you start with intention, you become someone who leads your life instead of chasing it. By the end of the week, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Control, not control of the world, but control of his attention. Samuel told him the point is not to build a perfect morning. The point is to choose the first input your brain receives. Because your first input becomes your first emotion becomes your first behavior, and behavior becomes your day. Ethan started building a simple morning formula, not complicated, just consistent. He called it the 3 decisions: what I consume, what I focus on, and how I speak to myself. In the morning, he consumed silence instead of chaos, because silence lets your mind settle. He focused on one intention instead of 1,000 worries, because intention creates direction. And he spoke to himself like a leader instead of a critic, because self-talk becomes your emotional environment. Ethan realized most people ruin their day before it begins, not because life is cruel, but because they start by surrendering attention. They wake up and immediately let the world decide their mood. They let notifications decide their priorities. They let comparison decide their self-worth. They let urgency decide their pace. And then they wonder why they feel exhausted, why they feel distracted, why they feel lost. Ethan stopped blaming himself for being inconsistent because he saw the pattern clearly. His mornings were programming him, and once you see the program, you can change it. He began to treat mornings like a doorway, and he stopped entering the doorway in panic. Some mornings he still felt heavy, because changing habits doesn't erase emotions instantly. But now he knew what to do when heaviness appeared. He slowed down, breathed, and chose the first direction again. He learned that the most important battle of the day is not at work, not with people, not with tasks. It is the battle for your attention in the first minutes after waking. Because attention is your life, and where your attention goes, your life follows. If you want a different life, you don't need a dramatic restart. You need a different morning start. You need 10 minutes of intention before the world reaches you. You need one decision before you consume anything else. You need one breath before you react. Ethan's life didn't change overnight, but his days became more stable, and stability creates progress. Progress creates confidence, and confidence creates a new identity. Ethan realized he wasn't building mornings, he was building a mind. And once his mind became steadier, everything else became easier to face. So if you feel like your life is slipping, if you feel like you're always behind, start here. Don't try to fix everything, fix the first 10 minutes. Don't ask for motivation, ask for direction. Don't start with noise, start with intention. Because your mornings decide your mind, and your mind decides your life. Try this tomorrow. No phone for 10 minutes, one glass of water, one deep breath, one sentence of intention. Do it for 7 days, and watch how the rest of your day begins to follow a new path. Not because the world changed, but because you entered the world differently. And remember this, quietly and clearly, the way Ethan learned it through repetition. Every story reshapes your mindset, and every morning is a chance to choose your life again. Have you ever wondered how some people seem calm and ahead while everyone else feels rushed? Like they found a quiet advantage that the world never talks about. You wake up and immediately feel the noise of life, the messages, the pressure, the speed, and you assume that's just what mornings are. But there is a different kind of morning, a morning that feels like space, and space is where clarity and power are born. This is the story of Noah, a man who didn't become stronger by doing louder things, but by practicing one quiet habit before anyone else woke up. Noah wasn't famous, and he wasn't special, because most people who change their lives aren't special. They're consistent, and consistency is usually silent. He lived a normal life, worked a normal job, carried normal stress, yet inside he had a feeling that his days were slipping away too fast. He didn't feel like he was failing, but he did feel like he was always reacting, as if the world decided his pace, and he simply tried to keep up. He tried the usual solutions, waking up early, chasing productivity, doing intense routines, but those methods often made him feel like he was fighting himself. The problem wasn't effort. The problem was how noisy his mind was, because a noisy mind turns every day into a struggle. Noah realized something painful. He was spending most of his life consuming other people's energy before he built his own. He woke up and immediately entered other people's worlds through screens, news, messages, and comparison. And by breakfast, his attention was already gone. That meant his day started with loss, and you can't build a strong life when you start every day losing your attention. One night, after a long day that felt like it went nowhere, Noah sat in his kitchen and listened to the refrigerator hum in the silence. He noticed how rare silence had become, and that realization made him feel both peaceful and sad at the same time. He remembered being a child, waking up early on weekends when the house was quiet and the world felt slow and safe. Back then, mornings felt like possibility, not pressure, and he wondered when he stopped feeling that. That night, Noah made a decision that sounded simple but felt serious. Tomorrow, I will wake up before the world does, not to work harder, but to breathe first. He didn't plan a huge routine, because huge routines break under real life, and he was tired of starting and quitting. He planned one habit, one quiet practice that could survive, even when he was tired, busy, or unmotivated. He called it the silent hour, even though it wasn't always an hour, because the name reminded him of the point. The point was not time. The point was silence, because silence is where you meet yourself again. He set his alarm 30 minutes earlier than usual. Not extreme, not heroic, just enough to create a gap before the world arrived. When the alarm rang, Noah's first instinct was to hit snooze, because the body hates change, even when change is good. He lay there listening to the darkness, feeling the temptation to return to comfort, and he realized this was the first battle of the day. Not a battle against work, not a battle against people, but a battle against the version of himself that wanted to stay asleep. Noah stood up anyway, not fast, not dramatic, just quietly, as if he didn't want to wake the old habits in his mind. He walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, and the water felt like a reset button for his body. He didn't turn on the TV, didn't open social media, didn't check messages, because the first rule of the silent habit was no input. No input means no other voices, no opinions, no emergencies, no comparisons, no news, no pressure. Because when you start the day with input, you start the day with reaction, and Noah wanted something else. He sat down at a small table with a notebook and a pen, and he noticed his mind felt restless, like it didn't know what to do. without noise. That restlessness was the evidence, the proof that his attention had been trained to avoid stillness. So Noah did the first part of the habit. 5 minutes of slow breathing, long exhale, short inhale, like he was telling his nervous system it was safe. At first, it felt pointless, because calm doesn't feel productive, and people who are anxious often confuse calm with laziness. But Noah stayed with the breath, and after a few minutes, the noise inside his mind softened enough for him to hear what he actually felt. Then he did the second part. 1 page of writing, not churling about everything, just 1 page answering one question. The question was simple. What matters today, and what doesn't? Noah wrote slowly, because speed would turn writing into another performance, and performance was what he was trying to escape. He wrote 1 priority, 1 thing that would move his life forward, not 10 tasks, not a list, 1 direction. Then he did the third part of the habit, 1 act of preparation, something quiet that would make the day easier. Sometimes it was laying out clothes, sometimes it was preparing coffee, sometimes it was organizing a desk, and the act felt small but powerful. Because preparation is a form of respect for your future self, and respect builds self-trust. After those 3 parts, Noah didn't feel like a superhero, but he felt centered, like his mind had a home base. And that was the first time in months he started a day without feeling behind. When the world began to wake up, Noah noticed the difference immediately. The messages arrived, the noise arrived, but his mind didn't collapse. He went to work and felt calmer, not because work became easy, but because he had already met himself before meeting the world. On day 2, it was harder, because the novelty was gone and the old habits returned with confidence. He wanted to check his phone, wanted to fill the silence, wanted to return to stimulation, but he remembered why he started. He remembered that every morning you practice something. Either you practice noise or you practice presence. So he practiced presence again, breath, 1 page, 1 preparation. By the end of the first week, Noah noticed something surprising. His days felt longer, not in hours, but in meaning. He realized time doesn't feel scarce when you stop wasting the first part of it in reaction. He also noticed he was less irritated with people, because irritation often comes from carrying stress you never processed. The silent habit gave him a place to process, a small private room inside his mind. In week 2, Noah began to see the deeper effect. He was building self-respect. Not the loud kind of confidence, but the quiet confidence that comes from keeping promises to yourself. He realized the world is loud, and loudness always tries to control you. But silence is where you take control back. He started saying no to unnecessary distractions, not because he became strict, but because he became protective of his attention. And the more he protected his mornings, the more he protected his life, because your attention is your life. Noah noticed he made better decisions, because decisions are easier when your mind isn't flooded. He noticed he ate better, spoke better, worked better, not through force, but through clarity. Week 3 arrived, and the silent habit began to feel like identity, like this is who I am now, the kind of person who begins with intention. Noah still had hard days, still felt tired, still felt heavy sometimes, because the habit doesn't remove life's difficulty. But the habit changed his posture toward difficulty, because he stopped meeting difficulty in panic. He began meeting difficulty after breath, after clarity, after preparation, and that sequence made him stronger. One morning, Noah woke up and realized something simple. The world didn't know he had changed, but he knew. And that knowledge was powerful, because it meant his strength wasn't dependent on validation. He understood that the silent habit wasn't about waking up early. It was about waking up before the world's noise entered his mind. Because most people start the day being invaded by other people's priorities. Noah started the day owning his priorities, and ownership creates peace. By day 30, Noah looked back and realized he had been searching for a big breakthrough when the real breakthrough was quiet. It was 30 minutes of silence that slowly rewired his mind away from reaction and toward leadership. He realized discipline doesn't have to be loud. It can be gentle, steady, and silent. And that silence became his advantage, because while others started in chaos, he started in control. So if you want to change your life, don't only chase louder motivation, build a quieter foundation. Tomorrow, wake up 30 minutes earlier and protect that time like it is sacred. No phone, no noise, no input, just breath. One page of clarity and one act of preparation. Do it for 7 days and notice what changes, not just in your schedule, but in your identity. Because your mornings are not just mornings, they are training, and whatever you train becomes your life. And remember this, quietly and clearly, the way Noah learned it before anyone else woke up. Every story reshapes your mindset, and every morning is a chance to begin with yourself.